So for this painting, I decided to paint Jameela Jamil because she's just so beautiful, and I saw this picture of her with this dress and I was super inspired by it, and so I thought I would give it a shot. I have just ordered a bunch of new Holbein Acryla Gouache paints, and so I thought this would be the perfect piece to try them out. I was also really wanting to do some pastel primaries. I've been really interested in using primary colors more in my artwork, but where they're not so bold and where they're kind of a little bit more pastel and a little bit lighter. Because if you're familiar with my art, you know I'm very inspired by like childhood themes, childhood toys, and primary colors is very common in childhood toys. So I wanted to influence my illustration with that a little bit. And so what I'm doing right now is I laid down the base in Prismacolor Col-Erase pencil in Carmine Red, I think it is. And well, first I did it digitally. I do a digital sketch in color plan, and then I'll use my iPad as a light table or a light, like a light source, and then I'll just trace over it with the pencil. And this allows me to get a clean sketch that I don't have to erase constantly and kind of make the paper a little muddy by doing that. After that's done, I grabbed some paint. I can use either black, blue, purple, something dark, and I go over all the lines with this paint. And this is where I intend on painting all my lines later. And the reason I do this is because gouache is very, very opaque, and it's hard to see those lines that you put down after you've already put down your first layer. And so by giving myself this kind of reference of some dark line work beforehand, it allows me to see some of those layers through that gouache. So what I'm doing now is I'm putting down my first layer of paint. I typically start with the skin first, and this is because this is the most kind of critical for me. I feel like if I don't do this correctly, the whole piece kind of loses its, its charm, and I feel like if I mess it up, I can just do another layer without being worried about affecting layers around it. So if I did the dress first and then I had to do multiple layers of the skin because I messed it up, I risk ruining the dress layer because it's right next to it. And so my first layer, which you're seeing here, I felt it was a little too yellow, and I wanted to have more of kind of like a pink undertone, which is what I felt she accurately had. So I went ahead and redid that. Typically with skin, I go ahead and do 2 layers anyway, just because I don't like how it can look patchy if I just do 1 layer. Especially if it's a darker color, you may need more than 1 layer. And now you can see I'm putting on the layer that is more pink. It's the one that I stuck with. Now what I'm doing is putting down my highlights. So I typically start with my base, and then I do my highlights, and then I'll do my shadow. And so for my highlights, I just take my base color and add a little bit of kind of like a yellowish cream color and maybe a little bit of white. I tried to not use just straight white or straight black, just because I feel that that can desaturate my tones too much and muddy my colors. And so I'll try to use like a cream or something like that. And then next I'm putting down my shade, and I'll do the same thing. I will just take my base color and mix in a little bit of brown, maybe a little purple if I'm looking for a really dark shadow, but I won't use black. Now it's time to paint the hair, and so she has dark hair, so I'm just using a brown. I think I'm using a burnt sienna, but I made it a little bit darker with some burnt umber. And same thing with the skin, I'll just put down my base layer first. And so my base layer, I'll do a couple layers, especially because this layer is darker and I don't want it to look patchy. And then I'll take my highlights and I'll again mix it with a lighter color that's not white, but usually like a more yellow or a cream. But in this case I did my shadow first, just because in my mind it made sense to map my shadow before the highlights. So it's not a rule that I'll always go base, highlight, shadow. Sometimes I'll go base, shadow, highlight. It just depends on the area that I'm painting and what would make more sense, because I don't want to go too hard with the highlight and I don't want to go too hard with the shadow. So I'll just see what kind of balance that I can find. And now I'm putting the base for the dress down while I'm letting the first layer of my hair dry. And so I'll put down big blocks of colors with my square brush, and then I'll go in and I'll use a finer brush to do those little smaller areas that I think need to be more precise. Now that my first layer of hair is dry, I'll put down my second layer using the same shade as my first layer. And I'm just gonna put this down and try to keep it as even as possible. It should only take just one layer, but after this, then I'll go in and do my shadow and then I'll do my highlight. As I'm waiting for my other layers to dry, I'm just going to go in with my finest brush, my thinnest brush, and I'm going to do the fine details on the eyes and the face. And this is a very stressful part for me, and it was especially stressful because I had the camera like right next to my face, and so I had to try not to bump the camera and try not to get my face in the shot and also get a good look. So this was very tense. But I try to just take it slow, take a few deep breaths before this part. And it's not the end of the world if you mess up. Just try to mix up some paint to cover your mistakes to the best of your ability. And I find that going in with like a really light wash at first is always best, because it makes your brush less heavy and it makes it a lot less gloopy and gloppy. And if you have a lot of paint on your brush, you're bound to make a lot more mistakes than if you go in with a very, very light amount of paint. And it also means the viscosity, it's a lot thinner, and so it's more easily worked. So that's what I would recommend, and that's what typically I do. So here is where I made a couple mistakes with that eye on the left. I went in a little too heavy with paint, but to fix that issue, I just got my brush wet and tried to wipe it away really fast. Acrylic gouache dries very fast, and when it does dry, it dries permanent. And remaking a color, especially one that you've mixed, is very difficult to recreate that color, because with gouache, the color that you see on your palette is not going to be the color that you see when you put it down. And so if you want to erase, you have to do it very quickly. And then next, I'm just putting in my shadow for my hair, and I'm just following where the waves lie and making those areas darker. So here I decided to start outlining the hair because I still wasn't sure how I would do the highlights yet. So I figured if I put down the outline and put in the individual strands, I could just always go in and highlight later. And so what I do is I just take my shadow color and I typically add some violet or maybe some even like darker brown, like a burnt umber. But I usually add violet so that it maintains a degree of saturation. Because as I said earlier, I don't want to just add black to whatever color I was using to make it darker, because that will typically make it just look muddy and it won't have that brightness and that light that I still want. So my next step is to add my darkest line work layer. And so for my line work, I typically have two shades. I have a lighter, more saturated shade, and then I have a darker, more desaturated shade. And I use that darkest shade to put where corners meet and where lines overlap. And I feel like this adds a greater sense of depth and a greater sense of character to my line work. Now that I'm about done, I go in with a white Posca pen. It's basically an acrylic, like a white acrylic pen, and I just add some touch-ups, some highlights, and this is typically my favorite part of the piece, and I'll just kind of mess around and see what looks nice. And that's pretty much it.